Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ethics of AI podcast. I'm your host, Matt Silk, and today we're going to be talking about the effect that AI is going to have on democracy and some of the concerns that arise when AI is applied in the realm of politics. And to do that, today I have a guest. His name is Dr. Jesse Hoey from the David R. Sheraton School of Computer Science at the University of Waterloo. He's also the leader in the Computational Health Informatics Lab. Hi, Jesse.
Hi, Matt.
Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
It's really good to have a computer scientist on finally to talk about some of these issues. We've had some people from philosophy and we've had some people from education so far, but it's nice to hear from somebody who has a perspective coming from a different discipline from computer science, which is very fitting, I think, in this case. So it'll be interesting to hear what your thoughts are today.
Great. Well, I'm happy to be here and looking forward to it.
Perhaps maybe just a little bit of background. So Jesse and I met a couple months back. We participated in a public debate on the question of AI and democracy, and we talked about some of the concerns that we have when it comes to the effect that AI can have on democratic systems and democratic norms. So, like I said, we participated in a debate not that long ago about the challenges that AI poses to democracy. How do you think does AI threaten democracy, and what do you think is the most significant concern?
Yeah, that's, I think in some sense, maybe the word threaten is a bit too strong there. I was reading the questions this morning and that you had prepared, and I think there are threats to democracy, but democracy is by its very nature is resilient, and so it's maybe sounds a bit negative, right? So maybe it's not so much a threat, but it is a threat that we can mitigate, I hope. But I think that the biggest problem or the biggest thing about AI that is going to cause difficulties in democracies is that the very fundamental nature of the way these AI chatbots, if you will, or large language models are built, is that they are unable to estimate value or risk to human beings. And it's sometimes it can be so. A large language model can tell you something about risk. It can say, this may be, this decision or this type of procedure might lead to some risks for some certain kind of, subset of the population, let's say. So that's typically a question that you would have to ask in a democracy: who's going to be impacted by this policy, let's say. And so it can tell you about these, risks in language, but the thing is that it has no way of associating these risks with the real world because it has no direct experience of the real world. And then what that means is that the AI can't judge two different possible outcomes relative to each other. In the sense that it can come up with some words about what the values or the risks are of a particular option, but it doesn't know how that's related to some words that describe some different option, right? It doesn't have a way of balancing these two things, whereas human decision makers do have this way because we have our own lived experience in the world. So that sort of lived experience allows us to take any possible imagined outcome or decision, that policy that's going to be implemented, and feel what it would mean in terms of the risks involved. And so this inability, or I'd say the AI will look like it understands the risks. It will tell you about what risks are or what values people have about certain things, but it can't actually feel those. It has no emotional connection to the real world. And then so far, okay, that's not a big deal. So, my car doesn't have an emotional connection to the real world either, right? And my car is a useful device that I can do things with, and it's helpful for maybe even for democracy, moving people around and so on and so forth. But then the problem is that people look at these artificial intelligences and fall prey to a category mistake. They think that they are humans, and then as soon as you make that assumption or you have that thought in your head, oh yeah, this must be basically like a human, then you will attribute the ability to estimate risk properly in terms of effects on the wider world. So you will attribute naturally these types of properties to AI. And then you get into a difficulty where people start believing that the AI truly understands what the risks are, and therefore political decisions can be made based on what these AI are saying, right? And then the humans, because they're, the politicians or the administrators or people are generally, they want to avoid doing a lot of extra work that they don't have to do. Well, you could just say, yeah, that must be right. We'll just trust the AI that it knows what's going on. But because it has no direct connection with the world, it doesn't actually, it was guaranteed to miss things. It's guaranteed to make mistakes, and then those mistakes are going to be very impactful potentially very impactful for some set of the population. So I think the most significant concern, to get back to the question, is people's inability to understand how these systems work, right? And what are their actual limitations.
So that's really interesting because so I've been doing some work on AI literacy and recently, and I was looking at again addressing some of these issues relating to like AI idolatry. This notion that people kind of over inflate the value of AI outputs and the lack of understanding there. And it's interesting because I was comparing the way an LLM, for example, if you were to ask an LLM about the risk of something, it would generate a number, right? And that number is, you could take it in a way, I guess, as being an estimate of risk, but that's very different from like an AI classifier model that's used by an insurance company that is also being used to evaluate risk, right? But they're doing doing very different things, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, the insurance company and the politician, you mean?
No, the two models, right? So an LLM, right, is essentially just trying to statistically come up with the next part of the sentence, right? Whereas a classifier model that's used, in actuarial science, is attempting to come up with a kind of actual estimate based on assumed model, assumptions and all that kind of stuff. But in that case, it's it still can't evaluate risk outside of what it's been trained on, but it is actually being used in that case. It is actually generating a prediction based on past experience in a way that an LLM isn't doing, because it's essentially just trying to come up with more text as part of a chat, right?
Mm. Yeah. So, but I think the difference with insurance companies I've always used computer models for figuring out, who gets what benefits or whatever. But those models in the past are things that are explicitly model a variety of causal factors, right? So they'll say, well, what's involved with the risk of granting someone selling someone an insurance policy, and then you can look at a number of different causal factors. Well, there's all the things like where they live, maybe where the person lives, their history. I don't know, all sorts of they use all sorts of different features, and then come up with some kind of causal model. Well, what does that mean as far as the likelihood that this person is going to have an accident or whatever? And the AI can do the same thing. It can also tell you these things, but you can't dig into it to find out why, right? So you get the answer, and maybe it's the right answer, but you have no real way of checking that it's the right answer. You see what I mean?
Yeah, so both models are both are susceptible to I think failure, but I think one of the interesting things is that the LLM and the actuarial model are even though they can both produce a value, they are doing different things. They're both susceptible to not being particularly good at what they're supposed to do. But even people who and so there are a lot of people out there who may not realize that AI is fallible in lots of ways. But then on top of that, they may not realize that the specific kind of model that they're asking a question of is not really generating a prediction in the way they think it's generating a prediction.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I would suggest. I mean, it's the large language model it may be making the prediction using the same data, right? And it may be making a prediction using the same causal factors. But we don't have any way of sort of verifying that, right? Other than asking the large language model to verify it itself, right? So it's like self-verifying, which it of course will happily do, and it might even generate those causal factors, right? But it doesn't understand as far as the world outside of language. It doesn't understand what that would actually mean in terms of people on the ground, right?
So this can be particularly problematic, obviously, going back to the question of democracy, because again, it makes people very susceptible to overvaluing AI because it looks like it's generating a sort of really good answer, even though it's not necessarily generating a really good answer. And then on top of that, we can't always necessarily explain how or why a model does certain kinds of things. I kind of want to jump ahead slightly to a different question because this is connected. So there was reported a couple weeks back that federal and provincial governments are looking into AI in order to analyze laws. And so they're using AI to analyze laws and regulations and trying to essentially take complex regulations and laws and then convert them into sort of more simple, plain language and analyze ways to make it more efficient and cost effective and all these other kinds of things. But again, it's interesting there because you have, like I said, you have AI analyzing government laws and trying to derive a kind of meaning from that in order to find efficiency. But similarly, like we were saying, right? Is there a potential risk there where, the AI may not understand or fully understand what it's doing, and that could end up becoming a problem? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely very much connected to our previous conversation. And I mean, one of the things about laws and regulations and policies is that they always have what's called a dark twin. So, and I see this all the time in my job, especially doing some administrative work here in the university. We spend a lot of time filling in all sorts of forms and to show that we're adhering to the university policies to do with all sorts of different things. But the forms come with a lot of difficulties and a lot of people don't necessarily understand why they're doing it. And so what arises as a sort of a complement to all this bureaucracy is these actual sort of communities of practice that are these are the people that are actually implementing these rules and regulations, right? And that dark twin is something that's always going to be there. It can be very destructive, it can be very productive, but it's extremely hard to put your finger on because no one will tell you that it's going on, right? Because you find a workaround around some form, you're not going to tell anybody. You're just going to use the workaround and hope nobody notices, right? And that's a dark twin. So I think if you go in and you start sort of arbitrarily reformulating laws, you have to understand that you are also changing these dark twins, these things that are actual practices of people on the ground, right? And so you go in and adjust something, even just the language that a law is that a law uses. I think of a form here at the university. Well, you adjust the language slightly, it has this massive ripple effect where their understanding of what it means changes, right? And that may make it more difficult for them to understand, or maybe easier to understand in a way that's incorrect. and then that will generate more of these dark twins. And so I think that it's doing that. You'd have to be incredibly careful to evaluate all possible contingencies, right, when you make these changes. And so in order, I would say that sounds like, okay, maybe this is a good idea. Cutting red tape might be a helpful thing, but it's got to be more than that. It's got to be cut the red tape and then have something in place that is going to monitor what's going on after the fact to make sure that there aren't these, strange kind of, sub things, these dark twins that are popping up, right? And because those can do all sorts of damage beyond even what the specific, law or policy is meant to address.
So do you think it does, given the problems that we were just discussing, right? Do you think that it, at least the idea of what the governments are attempting in this case makes sense? Does it make sense to try to use AI to find efficiencies within complex legal systems? Are there certain things that as a computer scientist, you think, yeah, we should be using AI for this, or are there other things that you think, oh, no, no, we should never use AI for certain kinds of things in government?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an AI scientist. I think it can have a lot of positive, it can make very positive change, but it is something that requires tremendous. I believe it requires a tremendous amount of care and thought if you're applying these things. And I think the danger is that the government's not necessarily putting that care and thought into it, right? And so I would, those sort of wider repercussions of changes that you might make are things that are really hard to estimate, right? And the sort of fallout or all the possible contingencies of some change need an enormous amount of sort of monitoring after the fact to make sure that, okay, this change actually did what we thought it would do, right? Or something along those lines.
Do you have a lot of trust in the concept? The term "human in the loop" is bandied around a lot. Do you feel like that there's a lot of reason to trust that concept? I feel like it's an odd question. Does it make sense, do you think, to put a lot of trust in that? Because I worry that it's very easy to say, oh, well, there's a human in the loop somewhere, so therefore it's all okay, even though what that human is doing may not actually put them in a position where they can actually be very responsible for large-scale decision-making.
Yeah, I agree. I think that human in the loop is. I do believe it's necessary, certainly at this point, until we gain some kind of trust of these, the abilities of these things. But you can't just have any human. You got to have the right human in the loop. You got to have someone who's able to see beyond that bias about believing that the AI is actually human, right?
Yeah, or I'm thinking of cases where, I think there was a case of at Immigration Canada where you had you had one human in the loop, but they were looking at literally thousands of cases at one time. Yeah. And it's hard to say you're doing real due diligence there over thousands of cases. Can you, technically there's a human in the loop, but are they really doing anything?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, I just, processed a whole lot of forms yesterday that have to do with this. We're unionizing our TAs in Waterloo, and I had to go through sort of on the order of 300 of these forms. But, these were done by humans, these forms. They were populated by humans, but it would be something that would be fairly straightforward for an AI to do. And then, I look at them and I think, okay, there's a team of humans here that did this. Therefore, if I spot check some of these things and I make sure everything's in order, then I can kind of make the jump that, yeah, okay, they know what they're doing. Everything's fine, right? But with an AI, that tendency will grow. So it'll be like, oh, not only is this a human-like thing, it's actually like people think of AI as being sort of super intelligent or better than humans. So you think, oh boy, this is even better than a human. So I really don't need to check that much, right? And so the sort of the oversight will naturally decrease, I think.
Yeah, it's true. Um, so there's a lot of, given the issues that come up with democracy, a lot of concerns that people have had, particularly in the idea of AI being used in government, is the, I guess, concern about the potential for increasing dependence on tech companies and big corporations and stuff like that. So, given the kind of influence that tech companies may come to have over democracies, how should democracies respond when considering whether they should adopt AI or not?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking about the companies. How should they respond, or how should the government respond?
So how given the so if the impact or the influence of large corporations grows with the adoption of AI, is this a potential threat to democracy? And how should democracies respond to this kind of threat?
Yeah, so I do think it's a threat. I mean, it definitely consolidates. I mean, we're seeing that right now as these AI things. There are lots of sort of there are efforts to really truly democratize this stuff, uh, and in the sense of allowing anybody who wants to use them. But that's a technical problem because these a lot of these big AI systems are incredibly resource intensive. So if I have a little startup, or I'm running a business out of my home, I'm not going to be able to afford one, right? So it's essentially trying to make them more affordable, really. Um, but the other thing is that I think that the way forward is it's a weird. There's a bit of a paradox, because what you sort of want to do is you want to reduce regulation to try to prevent these sort of monopolies in these big tech companies over of AI, because the big companies will use the regulations in order to protect themselves, right? So you see that a lot happening now, where the big tech companies are running around. It's to their advantage to talk about how AI is going to destroy the world, for instance, right? That there's an existential risk there. Why is it an advantage to them? Because it puts pressure on the politicians to regulate the AI. And then who is going to be, so they say, okay, we're going to have to issue a certain number of licenses, and only the licensed people can use AI. But then, of course, the big tech companies are first in line to get the licenses. So it's a bit of a paradox, because it feels like what you'd like to do is reduce regulation in order to allow more people to use it, but then reducing the regulation flies in the face of trying to actually control these things in a way that in any way that we can. That's sort of back to that sort of human in the loop kind of idea, right? You got to have some way of having checks and balances on all these things. But in the sort of flip side of that, I think, is that actually benefits these big tech companies. And I think it is really dangerous. I think having these giant, for-profit companies, and they tend to be they're not even Canadian companies. So as a Canadian, who's controlling everything that we do, right? If we see that a lot. You see that, your modern cars are all run by computers. You have no access to the underlying technology, and you are forced to, pay whatever they want in order to get your car fixed. So it's really undemocratic in that sense. You don't have direct access to what you need.
So it's interesting because, like, we as we've said before too earlier, that oftentimes these AI systems are very difficult to kind of explain, and very difficult therefore to be accountable for them, and this can make things very difficult when it comes to trying to keep large tech companies, particularly if we're integrating them into government operations, to keep them accountable if certain aspects of the system aren't explainable or aren't transparent. Does it suggest a problem with trying to keep companies like this accountable as well, do you think?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely. It's very difficult to figure out how you would actually do that in practice. I mean, because the explanations of how these things work are are also generated by large language models themselves, or so they suffer all the same flaws as the whatever the large language model is being used to do in the first place, right? So I think to me that's the sort of big issue, is that we don't. It's the I guess if I was going to look at a policy decision and then sort of explain why this policy decision was being made, then I'd be a political scientist, and I would analyze the problem sort of, much more holistically, right? So what are all of the things that might sort of have a role in this, including the fact that the politician wants to get reelected and they have a certain, persona to fulfill or whatever else. So that's where I think that's where the rubber really meets the road, is that the sort of explanations are just as flawed as the actual AI itself, and they can be sort of twisted as all explanations are. They can be sort of twisted in all sorts of different ways that benefit different political agendas, let's say. So having an explanation is not like the large language model itself has all this bias in it, but then the explanation has just as much bias in it. So there's sort of no way out, if you will, unless you actually get a human to look at the problem and say this is what they think is going on, or this is what the impacts of this policy might be.
So we've kind of like butted into I think the next question that I was going to ask, which is about the government of Canada's recently announced AI strategy, right? Mm. A lot of the themes that we've been talking about fit into this question. I have some more specific questions I'll ask you in a second, I think, based on what we were just discussing. But what are your general thoughts on the AI strategy?
I mean, to me, when I didn't read it in full, so I'm not an expert on this, but I think that the idea of having a strategy about AI is a good one. I mean, this is here, and it's causing all sorts of things to happen, and so sort of having some kind of strategy at a national level is really a good idea. But one of the things that I believe what I read about is that the AI strategy doesn't have any sort of explicit pointers towards regulation. So it doesn't seem like they're heading down the road of regulating AI, which is much more the sort of European way of. It seems to be the direction the Europeans are taking is much more regulation, right?
There's a lot of discussion on things like the question of sovereignty, and which I find kind of interesting, because I feel like the issue of sovereignty is kind of bandied around a lot, and I think one of the questions that we have to consider is, what do we actually mean by this? So, for example, the strategy explicitly mentions that Canada has no capacity to produce the chips that are required to make AI run. Right. So, and so there's a lot of discussion about trying to get more control over some of the infrastructure and control over the data, and potentially have the ability to engage in some regulation for at least Canadian companies. As opposed to American companies, which would be difficult to regulate from the government of Canada's perspective, right? With these policies that they want to introduce to make things more sovereign, it raises an interesting question, because, for example, if you don't have, what does sovereignty actually mean? How much do you actually need to control before you can claim that you're sovereign, right? If you can't literally make the hardware that is required for it, then can you really claim to be sovereign?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you have to. I think politically the answer is you have to have good allies that you trust, right? I mean, the chip makers are. Let's say in another country, and we don't have the technology or we don't have the investment to actually start building them here in Canada. It's so cheap to get them from somewhere else. But then you come into this notion of trust. Well, do we trust the people making the chips, right? But you would, I mean, in my mind, you'd have that same problem with a Canadian company, right? I'd say, okay, we're going to have this Canadian company make these chips. Well, who knows what they're up to, right? So I think that the idea of sort of being able to be completely in control of your own AI is probably a bit of a pipe dream.
Well, this is what I kind of wonder is sovereignty essentially in this context, is it essentially more of a political concept than an actual concept, right? Is it more of it's a way of soothing feelings or something like that, soothing egos or concerns, but it doesn't actually reflect anything, right? Because you can't really claim to be sovereign if you don't have, if you're dependent on others, then you can't really claim to be sovereign, can you?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, the pace at which these things are changing is also, I mean, we might be achieve what they might want to call sovereignty over some form of AI, but then, in a week it'll be totally different, right? So you have to have, I guess you have to have a lot of, procedural elements to make sure that these things are maintained, right? Because you will lose that sovereignty very quickly as the technology grows, unless you manage to be at the very forefront of all development. But that's hard to imagine for a country the size of Canada.
So the government strategy also seems to focus a lot on the question of adoption. It points out the fact that Canadians and Canadian companies have had a somewhat lower adoption rate of AI compared to other companies. Do you see this as being a sort of significant issue in terms of Canada? Should we Canadian companies be focused on AI adoption? What kind of adoption do you think might make more sense, right? Should we just be focusing on the question of adoption generally, or should we be asking more specific kinds of questions than that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a risk-seeking individual, so that might sort of cloud my answer. But I think the Canadian approach of being a little more cautious, if that's what's going on, seems like a very wise approach. I mean, because we have very little way of estimating what the sort of even short-term impacts of these changes if we start implementing AI in a bunch of things. Earlier you were talking about the government cutting red tape. Well, that sounds like a great idea, but it's very difficult to estimate what are going to be all the repercussions of this across the many different, aspects of society. The only way you can find that out is by actually doing it and then monitoring and seeing what happens, right? So I feel like a little bit of caution is well advised in this instead of jumping on the bandwagon. And it's very tempting that people are making a lot of money off of this, but when there's people make a lot of money, people also lose a lot of money. So there's it's a double-edged sword, I think.
So the government estimates that they believe that they can create 90,000 jobs using this AI strategy. Do you think that's realistic or likely?
This is the cutting the red tape is going to create jobs, or it's the just generally
just increasing AI adoption in the Canadian economy generally.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's unlikely that we will achieve that. I mean, it's interesting, this AI in particular, because it really was invented in Canada by a British guy, actually. Well, there's a number of people, a lot of people involved, but I mean, it was invented in in the machine learning group, and in Toronto had a huge role to play in the early development of AI. There's many other groups in the world, but the University of Toronto certainly had its hands in the mix. But as soon as this started to actually do something and be do something seemingly reasonable, or it looked like it was actually working well, all these people were poached and they all went to California, right? I mean, some stayed behind, but it's very, very hard to retain that talent, right? And then if you can't retain the talent, you can't really retain those fundamental ideas. They didn't go and start companies here in Canada. They went, and, those companies were bought out by big companies in the States, and it's very difficult to get around that. So I would think that it's probably that Canada has to accept the fact that a lot of this stuff is going to be built by other countries, built in other countries by corporations, and focus on the things that we really can do, right? So a lot of people think that's sort of more on the application side of AI. So can we should we invest in actual, applications, things that use AI to solve specific, Canadian, maybe even sort of uniquely Canadian problems, let's say.
Yeah, I'm thinking like agriculture.
Yeah. Or managing the north, or that the things that are really uniquely Canadian. There's a lot of interest in the north of Canada now as the climate warms, and that I believe is going to be a huge aspect of politics going forward, or international politics, and so maybe that kind of thing.
So maybe I have time. I can ask you one more question. This is like slightly different, but obviously AI development has had a huge sort of impact and will continue to have a huge impact on the world. And it raises a lot of interesting questions about the development of technology, the development of AI, who's it for, what is it supposed to accomplish, and who's really responsible when things start to kind of get out of hand. So what I'm interested in is your perspective as a computer scientist, right? What responsibility do you think computer scientists have when it comes to developing AI systems that can undermine society? Who do you think should be responsible when AI goes wrong? And should computer science students receive more training in should computer science students receive more ethics training as part of their education?
Yeah, so I guess I believe that they should. I think that we are already seeing computer science education changing pretty dramatically, and one of the interesting things is that we tend to think of computer scientists as being very technical jobs. A computer scientist writes code that does a specific thing. But it turns out that's actually only one piece of the puzzle, because there is the code, and that's the sort of technical side of it. But then there's two other much more sort of human sides to software development. One is the sort of cognitive side, so understanding how it works. That comes back to our discussion about explanation, right? So for a computer scientist, the way that we do that is we write documentation, right? So we say, okay, here's how this system works. And then the other sort of pole of it is the intent. Why are we doing this? What is this software meant to accomplish? And there we get back to our discussion of risk. What risks are involved? What could be impacted beyond just the specific application of the code that we're trying to write? And what happens in software development teams is they balance these three things out, right? So they kind of they will find some kind of balance between these things, that you want a certain amount of sort of technical expertise, but you also want this ability to understand the how and the why of why we're doing this. And what you find is that when you do this, the modern software development is now done largely by these large language models. You may sort of solve that technical problem. Now you've got code that works or whatever else, but you've lost those other two pieces, right? So people will stop understanding why they're doing it and also how it is actually being done, right? So I think that and this happens, so people are software developers in companies, in industry, have run into this wall where things seem to be going really well at the start, but then as you go further along, they start to drop the AI, because the AI code, they can't understand what it's doing, and they can't understand why it's doing what it's doing. right? So they tend to sort of start replacing the AI generated code with human generated code, which is structured and is easier for humans to understand. So I think that the responsibility does lie with the computer scientists, but they need to realize that they're not just computer scientists that generate technical content. They're also cognitive scientists that need to understand the how and the why, and what are the impacts on the wider society. So I think we need to shift our sort of training of computer scientists from just, here's how you code, to, here are the implications, here are the things that are happening, the how and the why, essentially. So I think the training part of that obviously includes ethics and how do you approach these questions, right? So what is this going to do to the wider society? So I think that we need, computer scientists need to sort of become, I guess our computer science education needs to include, I would say, not just an ethics component, but a much wider sort of cognitive science component.
So this has been an interesting conversation. I really enjoyed being able to chat about the AI strategy and the effects of AI in democracy. It was good chatting with you, Jesse.
Great to talk to you too, Matt, and look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be able to have you on again. We can talk about some more issues involving the ethics of AI. So Jesse Hoey is the professor at computer science at the University of Waterloo, and I'm again very happy that he was able to join us again today. Thanks again.
Thank you, Matt.
Alrighty, and I'm going to sign off now. I'm your host, Matt Silk, and I will catch you in the next one, okay?